This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Thank you very much for listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. My guests today are Paul McLaughlin and Mark McMinn, and I'll give you their bio in a second, but I appreciate all those who've rated and reviewed the podcast. If you like the podcast, please do give it a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and thanks to all those who've supported me on Patreon. I appreciate all your support, and as always, the show notes, links to the books, links to the things we discuss will be at themoralimagination.com, and also there you can get a free infographic from my little book called Digital Contagion, which gives 10 basic steps to protect yourself from surveillance, capitalism, etc. And the first one is pay for your email. So anyway, my guest today, very delighted to have doctors Paul McLaughlin and Mark McMinn. Paul is a graduate from the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he studied religious studies and philosophy. And then he has a master's degree in theology and Christian ministry from Franciscan University of Steubenville and a doctorate in clinical psychology from George Fox University, and he works as a registered licensed clinical psychologist in Salem, Oregon. Mark McMinn is a faculty emeritus at George Fox University. He too is a licensed psychologist in Oregon, a fellow and former president of the APA's Division 36, which is Society for Psychology of Religion and Spirituality. And he's board certified in clinical psychology through the American Board of Professional Psychology. He also was a professor for a number of years at Wheaton. And I'm delighted to have both of you on the show, Paul and Mark. Thanks for joining the Moral Imagination.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's not too often we get to talk with a philosopher who's also a filmmaker, so it sounds kind of fun.
It just means I'm a dilettante. So thanks for joining. We're going to talk about your book called A Time for Wisdom, and the subtitle is Knowledge, Detachment, Tranquility, and Transcendence. And it's a really interesting book, and I'm glad to talk about it. Before we do, I didn't tell you this as we were going, Paul. So I actually did a graduate philosophy at Steubenville. So we have that. And then I grew up in Ventura, California. So not very far from UCSB, which is
I lived in Ventura for many years, actually.
Okay, good. Yeah, I grew up.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's a great place.
The blue collar Santa Barbara.
Yeah, there you go. I moved to Western Michigan for the weather, which has summers. It has actually, the funny thing is it has summers like Southern California and winters like Michigan. So it's a great place. All right. So let's talk a little bit about your book. So it's an ambitious book. And I know part of it was based on, Paul, your doctoral work. It's a psychological, philosophical study about wisdom. So why don't you just give us a big kind of overview of the book, why you wanted to write it, and what inspired you, or why you think it so matters to talk about wisdom in our time?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, the book is timely, and it's a time for wisdom, as the title suggests, because there's so much conflict, polarization. It seems like we're on the precipice of some great calamity, and there's just so much like ideological, siloing. And I've been attracted to the topic since I was an undergrad. And, when I had the opportunity to choose a topic to study for my dissertation, Mark gave me the freedom to choose a big topic, which I was very grateful for. And I immediately gravitated towards wisdom and looked into the literature, the psychological social science literature, and noticed that there was a real absence of religion and spirituality, which was, surprising to me. And so, Mark and I did a pretty nice, I think, study and dissertation, which was funded by the Templeton Foundation. And that study, I think it was pretty successful. And we wanted to build on that and kind of draw from some of the insights in the study to a more broader, book that would maybe speak to a more general audience. And knowledge, maybe I'll talk about the 4 categories later if you want, but
Paul's being nice to me because so what happened from my perspective is I was a faculty member at this university. Paul was a doctoral student. He comes into my office and he says, I want to do my dissertation on wisdom. And I said, well, it's a great topic, Paul, but psychologists don't really study wisdom. So he goes to the library and he proves me wrong. It turns out that psychologists have been studying wisdom for a long time, and I just didn't know about it. Most of the literature comes out of Europe. Most of it comes out of developmental psychology. So it was great fun for me to find out that there's this whole area of scientific inquiry and wisdom that I just didn't know about. And I don't know how many years ago that was, Paul, maybe 11 or 12 years ago, but it's been a great adventure for me to learn about this.
What were the things that really struck you that, like, with something when, as you went into this literature, is there anything a couple things that stood out to you as surprising or really revolutionary in your thinking?
The first thing that caught my attention was that just the assumption we make that wisdom increases over time. In some of the early studies in Germany, that was not shown to be true. Now we probably will talk about this, but we can question whether you can really measure something like wisdom. But if you assume we can, what we see, at least in Germany, is that it plateaus around age 35. Wisdom increases in life until 35, and then it stays pretty flat across the lifespan, which is really different than what we've often heard and assumed about how wisdom develops.
Yeah. I mean, it seems anecdotally everyone would say that's not true, right? Like if you just did we'll just do a survey of 8 billion people and everybody 35 and older, and most people would say, oh no, I think I'm wiser than I was when I was 35. I mean, what would you say to that? Like, in a sense, I mean, I joke about anecdote, but it's almost like, how did the study come out with 35? I mean, it seems like most people would think if you did surveys that they were wiser. Where am I wrong there?
Well, Paul's first author in this book. I'm just talking all the time here, but and Paul, I want to hear from you too. But I think it's fascinating when you look cross-culturally. The study I mentioned was an early one in Germany. There have been the subsequent studies in Japan and the United States. In the United States, it turns out wisdom does increase over the lifespan. So if you talk to people in the United States, probably will be right when we say, yeah, it gets better over the lifespan. In Japan, it's more like Germany. About age 35, it plateaus. But the interesting thing is that in Japan, the average 35-year-old is about as wise as the average 60-year-old in the United States. So it's like they get there earlier and then they plateau. And in the U.S., we sort of take a slower path. But again, this all presumes that we can measure a thing, and that's going to be an interesting part of our conversation, I assume.
Right.
Okay, Paul, right. I'm sorry. I just keep talking like a professor here.
I love it. Yeah, I mean, part of what I was just struck by was the fact that there was so much literature out there. I mean, it was just, I didn't know what I would find. I just wanted to study the topic. I knew there was, obviously, it had been studied by philosophers and theologians for centuries, eons, but just the fact that I kept the amount of articles that I found and the research, I was like, wow, psychologists have, and mostly developmental psychologists have really been studying this topic of wisdom since I believe the early 80s. And I just found that fascinating in and of itself. And, some of the overlap between the humanities and the social sciences, which I was really happy, I wouldn't say surprised to see, from someone with a Thomist background, where the natural and the supernatural, do have an analogous way of existing, as the way I understand it from my own tradition. So, but yeah, one of the, I think, impetuses behind the book to write it was just to introduce the general audience to the topic of wisdom from a psychological perspective. I thought it was just important to try and show as many people as possible that this very fascinating, important virtue has been studied scientifically, and here's kind of our take on it.
Great. So I have a couple questions about that and the scientific study of wisdom, but maybe first you do give a definition of wisdom, right, in your book. So why don't you lay out for us what wisdom is?
Yeah. What ego, I know, and hubris to think that you can define wisdom. Well, I mean, I think wisdom, as it breaks down into the 4 categories, involves knowledge, detachment, tranquility, and transcendence. I think those were really the 4 pillars that I saw in both my studies in the humanities and within the psychological research, and just trying to create, some sort of template. And it's not a 4 steps to wisdom book, but I do think that you can broadly break any tradition of wisdom down within those 4 steps. I think East and West, I think it involves some form of knowledge, detachment, tranquility, and transcendence.
Okay, well, let's go into those. So you have a definition on page 13. You say wisdom is embodied, it's a disposition or act, which is interesting. So it's an act, right? A disposition or an act, right? That involves critical contemplation, purgation and purification of knowledge with practical implications that leads to self-transcendence, tranquility, and elevated insight. Okay, so that's hard to, I know, follow for listeners, but we'll go through it. So why don't you just say first, and then I do want to absolutely go through your 4 stages, because
Sure.
I think you did a really good job on like going through explaining knowledge and the kinds of knowledge, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But you first say that it's embodied. I have a podcast episode with Professor Jim Madden, on embodied, embedded persons. And one of the ways I talk about human persons when I give talks is that we are embodied, so that we're not driving around in our body like we're driving around in a car. We don't just bump in like, oh, sorry, my body hit you. But we're ensouled organisms, we're embodied, and that we're embedded. We're embedded in culture, language, deep levels of complexity and history. And that oftentimes one of the confusions we have in today that I think affects so many things is we don't have a very rich understanding of embodiment or embeddedness. But you start your definition as embodied. Could you maybe explain a little bit what you mean by embodied and why wisdom is first embodied in your definition?
I think you just did that for us. Thank you. Everything that you just I just say yes.
Okay, we're going to re-record that.
Everything that you just said, Michael, and and it's maybe easy to think about the intellectual virtues as as sort of in more of a Platonic form, where they're the body is a problem, rather than part of the process of the development and cultivation of the virtue. As you said, we exist with language and culture, and context really matters, and our own physical body matters. I think, some of that, the embodied part of it maybe speaks to, mine and Mark's Christian background with the idea of the incarnation, and the virtues have become embodied and changed in a physical way.
Can I give an illustration of this? So I had this lifelong dream of building a house. And in my late 40s, I actually had a chance to do it. So we moved back to Oregon, which was my home state, from Illinois, bought this property and built a house. Now, I had a lot of help with it, but I did a whole bunch of it myself. One of the things I noticed is that the first few months, I was just constantly bleeding. I would get cuts on my hands and bruises and smashed fingernails, and because I just didn't know enough about how to use the tools that I had to use to kind of keep myself safe. But over time, by the end of the process, what I discovered is I had almost no injuries. It's like the embodied experience of pain was a great lesson for me about how to use a hammer or how to use a sawzall. You learn these things through your body, and that's the way wisdom works so often. As we encounter pain and we say, oh, I need to do that differently, and so we grow in our process and our wisdom.
No, that's very helpful. I mean, in a sense, we're jumping ahead, but it's that, Aristotle has this concept of phronesis, St. Thomas, of practical ways, practical intellect that comes from experience. There's a line in Aristotle that says, young people are good at geometry, but they don't have phronesis. They don't have this experience. And I think coming from the embodied experience of pain, of sadness, et cetera, it gives you, and again, we're kind of in a tautology here, but it gives you this wisdom, which will continue to develop. So one quick question. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I actually do this in a number of episodes where I talk about this, but you mentioned this idea in an incarnational way of seeing the body. And I'm Catholic as well. And, one of the things, I have a podcast with James Poulos about technology and spiritual politics of digital war. And we talk about there that one of the things that is essential in Christian theology is the resurrection of the body. You get your body back. So your body's not an accident, right? There's not a Manichaean escape from the body, or right, the body is not something that is holding you back, but that needs to be integrated. And this is maybe a big question. Again, we don't need to spend a lot of time, but it struck me as you talked about this, Paul, with increasing materialism and transhumanism, the idea you're going to upload yourself, the idea of seeing your, kind of your brain as in the metaphor of a computer, zeros and ones. Does materialism create an obstacle to wisdom?
Well, I mean, my initial response is yes. I don't know, exactly how to flesh all that out. I think a lot of that's in the book in terms of humility, of not getting too attached to things of the body, things of the flesh, to use a more maybe traditional term. But yeah, I think it because of the way that we tend to attach to things in the material world and become, all consuming with them, it kind of narrows and constricts our gaze then. And I think wisdom speaks to perspective, a broader perspective, which is one of the key terms of wisdom in the psychology and in the positive psychology literature is perspective, which is kind of seeing from a broad view. And I think materialism can again constrict us, taking our gaze, downward.
And so the reductive nature stops perspective, perhaps.
Yeah.
It's also interesting because again, it's kind of dialectical, but the lack of wisdom. But as that maybe is lost, that could also be a cause for transhumanism. You think that in a sense we've lost this embodied idea of going through time of knowledge, of detachment. And so now we become, it like leads us into kind of a technical solution and an escapism through transhumanism as well. I don't know. It seems maybe that it's in a bit of a vicious circle.
Yeah.
Do you think that makes sense?
Yeah. I think that makes sense. I don't know if you wanted to add something, Mark, but.
Well, I'm the guy in the room that doesn't have a graduate degree in philosophy, so I don't know that I have a lot to add. Although I will just observe that I think there are two ditches on this road. That yes, a radical materialism can cause us problems, but so would a radical Gnosticism. We were just talking about being embodied, so I think that's the whole nature of the Christian faith, is that we somehow believe that there is this sort of mysterious integration between the material and the spiritual, and wisdom shows up in that mysterious space, would be my perspective.
I think that's good, actually. I mean, I talk about this also a lot, that there's I think sometimes in the reaction to the errors of materialism, we become spiritualists. But that's an error too. So no, I think that's very important. Okay, so we talked a little bit about embodiment. Let's keep moving. So it's embodied. It's a disposition or an act, right, that involves critical contemplation. So I don't know if you want to talk about disposition or act at all, but I think we should at least go quickly into critical contemplation, because you can do disposition as well, but because that's, I think, going to bring you into that whole idea of now knowledge and your fourfold step. Do you want to develop that a little bit?
I just think disposition or act is really most base in its basic sense. It's a state trait thing, right? If you once, if from time to time we have moments of wisdom, which I think many of us do, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have this sort of habitual, state of being wise all the time. And so you can be wise for a moment and lose it. I think Solomon is the best example of this. He had wisdom, but then he made poor decisions. He lost it. But, it gave us, some of the best historical examples of wisdom. And so I think it's that state trait difference there.
Well, so I know what you mean, but let's develop that for listeners. So you make this position that in one sense, wisdom is a trait. You have, some people are just more naturally wise at least in certain domains, and other people. So I might have just a natural advantage in wisdom in one thing, and you might have it in another, or just generally more than another person. But it's also a state or a habit, something that you can develop. Is that the disposition? So there's a disposition towards it, but then there's an act where there's agency involved. And again, we're kind of jumping into it makes sense though. I mean, your whole book is connected, that developing knowledge and transcendence and tranquility, you can actually work on that and thereby become wise. Am I understanding that state trait correctly?
Yeah. And maybe this is the clinical psychologist in us, right? Who believes that, you can grow and change and develop, better habits of living and cultivate the virtues. But I don't think it's maybe once have always, always be there, always present. I mean, I'm sort of, you never realize just how difficult, wisdom and how complicated it is until you write a book on it. And then you realize, just how much, you fail in your own life in terms of making, wise choices, wise decisions. So it's convicting in that way, both from a state and a trait, perspective. So.
Yeah, I think so. Well, actually, and so when I read the book, I actually a couple times I did feel convicted. You know, you have like, Les, you do this, you think, you know, oh, I may think of myself as wise, but if that's wisdom, I've failed here and here and here. And by the way, what you said reminds me of one of the famous philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, and Mike Tyson, who said everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yes.
And that is actually, I think, something that goes through the book, right? With wisdom, like I can be very calm, detached, and tranquil until like, you know, something happens and I'm really tired and all my wisdom is out the door. Yeah. And I think Solomon's a great example for that. Mark, you wanted to jump in?
Well, I just wanted to say to your question about can wisdom be learned, you know, this was the ball that got rolling with this book is Paul's dissertation, which essentially was a study looking at young adults in a mentoring program in a local church. And he found that, yes, indeed, these young adults could grow in wisdom over a relatively short period of time through a mentoring program.
Yeah, maybe before we go, just real quickly, that would be good. I asked that earlier and we kind of got off track. Sorry about that. Could you just go quickly and is there any more detail you want to give on that study? Because that's part of the empirical element of wisdom, right?
I think we had it showed some increases in, I think it was a younger population. It's been a few years now since I looked at the study, but they showed some increases. There are measurements of wisdom. You know, maybe that's surprising that, you know, there are tests and measurements that we have for wisdom. And it showed that over time, there was improvement within the experimental group in not just wisdom. I believe it was also post-formal thinking, which is, you know, sort of a way of being able to think from a broader perspective, and also life satisfaction. And Mark, you can correct me if I get some of these wrong because it has been a while since I looked at it. But yeah, happiness, wisdom, post-formal thinking, there was improvements in a few areas. And I remember us being pretty happy when we looked at the data.
Before we go now, so we've started the first part of the definition, and the second part of the definition really gets into your 4-step process. So let me just do one pushback here, and you address it a little bit in the book. I think a lot of people would say, I mean, is it a bit of a folly to try to measure wisdom? Are you taking an overly empirical way of seeing the world, and that there's something inarticulate about wisdom, and that this social science approach just it may be just misaligned with the whole concept? And obviously you've wrestled with that question. So how do you respond to that kind of skepticism that, you know, I could see, especially, you know, I'm trained in philosophy. I could see philosophers like, oh, great, social scientists trying to do wisdom, you know, and closing their perspectives, lacking humility, all that stuff. You obviously wrestle with this. So how do you respond to that?
And I might jump in here because it's a question, as a psychologist who studied positive psychology for a couple decades, it's a question I get a lot. First, I just want to honor the question. I think it's exactly the right one to be asking. And I think there is something a bit anemic about self-report scales for any trait that we're trying to measure in psychology. So a classic example is humility. If you want to measure humility, do you really just ask people to take a 10-item scale and say how humble they are? Or are you going to get something backward with that, you know? So same with wisdom. Can you really do a self-report scale on wisdom? So yeah, it's exactly the right question. Now, in defense of the field, I will say that these scales have been carefully developed according to the rules of the guild in terms of how you go about determining reliability and validity and connecting it with external criteria and all those sorts of things. Some of the scales are developed apart from self-report. There are sort of examples. You give a person a problem to solve, and then you look at the essay they produce, and you rate the essay according to criteria that the expert judges have for what wisdom is. So I think the field has progressed as well as any social science field has in terms of measuring a thing. But I think you're exactly right that that's the Achilles heel of social science, is we have to measure things to study it, and our measurements can be anemic at times.
Mm-hmm. And you need wisdom to be able to choose the right things to measure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess this is what happens when, you know, someone who just came off of a master's in theology goes into a psychology, you know, program, and you ask him what he wants to study for his dissertation. You know, it's going to be something big and, you know, And I think Aquinas had some quote about this of like an imperfect understanding of a sublime truth is better than perfect knowledge of a lesser truth.
Yep.
And so a part of me is sort of like, well, I don't care. I would rather try and tackle a beautiful, much needed, virtue as wisdom or happiness or something or love and maybe just, I don't know, catch a little bit more of its rays than and be able to say, yeah, I couldn't fully capture and understand it, but I got to spend time with it. I've spent the last, I think, 10 years of my life, studying wisdom. That's pretty cool. And I would rather do that than maybe, study something which is more concise and I can have a very clear, perfect understanding of it. I think that's sort of the limited gaze of kind of that reductionist, materialist view of science. And
it's good. I love it. That's a beautiful answer, by the way. I like your answer. I think it's a great answer personally, because you got to spend all this time doing wisdom. I think it's a big answer, a good answer in thinking that in a sense there are limits to the empiricist's mind. One of them is that they can't empirically prove that empiricism is right. But I think it's also just a beautiful answer because it's a human answer, and it reflects, I think, one of the themes that comes up, even the name of this podcast is the moral imagination, right? That's from Edmund Burke, that the moral imagination had been hollowed out, that we'd lost the sense of complexity. It's what C.S. Lewis talks about in Abolition of Man, men without chests, that we've lost that. And so this kind of going after something big and wrestling with what really matters, because, as I talk about a lot, it's not just incoherent on its own terms, empiricism. It actually takes the most important fundamental questions of life, beauty, goodness, happiness, wisdom, love, joy, compassion, and puts them outside the realm of rational. So they become emotive. And I think this combination of philosophy and social science is, I think, a really a good, worthwhile task. And I like how you say that, Paul, when you're like, okay, so I didn't get it, but at least I got some rays and I got to spend 10 years doing it. So It's great.
Hopefully,
and I think
hopefully.
Well, no, but I think, and in the book, it's a hard topic, but I do think you do give some pretty good insights, and there's some, I benefit from it for sure. So let's keep going with your argument. So one of the things that you say in order to have wisdom is you need critical contemplation. Maybe tell me, what do you mean by critical contemplation and how do you practice it? Because you argue wisdom can be learned. You said this is the premise of the model we present in this book, that people can become wiser with time and practice. And the first thing you need is critical contemplation.
Yeah, I think maybe that's a confusing way of saying what I really think is about problem solving. The critical thinking is sort of a combination of critical thinking and contemplation. I think that contemplation is an important practice, which many people now write and talk about, to just simply sit and be present with thoughts, feelings, or try to still the mind, empty the mind. Contemplation, right? Being present to the divine. And then, but I think for wisdom's sake, because wisdom tends to often involve problem solving, right? I mean, we seek wisdom when there's something that we can't seem to fix, can't seem to solve, whether it's big questions. And so I wanted there to be some sense of critical thinking too, like taking from your contemplation some critical understanding and response to a certain problem. So it's not just contemplations for contemplation's sake, but a critical contemplation of going into that space and trying to understand, because it is an intellectual virtue. It's embodied, but does always fall under the heading of intellectual and even cognitive virtue. So problem solving, thinking are an important part of it.
Mm-hmm. So in a sense, if I understand you from that explanation, that the critical contemplation is the disposition and habit of preparing yourself for knowledge, especially for what you call enriched knowledge, which we'll get to, and detachment and tranquility, because you can't do detachment if you're not critically contemplative. Am I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I think detachment happens with the Mike Tyson thing. I think you get life punches you in the face. You don't really have time to critically think or contemplate about it. It happens. But I think what you do with that, if you take that into the practice of critical contemplation or something like it, yes, I think that would be one of the steps, important movements, if you will, in development of wisdom.
I wonder too how much social media has changed our ability for critical contemplation in our world. There's lots of critical on social media. Criticism's really rampant, but it's not like critical contemplation where you actually stop and think, "Hey, I could be wrong about this. Is there another way to look at this?" And we used to hear about sound bites. Now we hear about memes. But in both cases, it's like I don't really have to think about this. I just have to believe what I've been told here, and that's the engine that sort of churns our thinking so much in contemporary life, I think.
I think that's right. I mean, I think so. So I had a podcast with a man named Jaron Lanier, who wrote 10 Arguments to Delete Your Social Media Accounts Right Now, and a couple of other books.
Oh, he wrote You Are Not a Gadget, right?
Exactly. That's the same guy. Yeah. So I did an interview with him, and we talk a lot about this problem of social media. This is like, I'm capitalistically promoting all my podcast episodes, which I don't get paid for. But anyway, then I also did one with a man named Luke Burgess on his book called Wanting, which is Rene Girard and the idea of mimetic desire and how we're influenced. And you write about this issue of, you talk about like social media leading to confirmation bias, to making ourselves cognitively rigid. But I think it's a really important point, so that you're trying to, in a sense, resist the meme prepackaged way of seeing the world by critical contemplation, and that's wrestling with some of the deeper questions. Is that the response you're giving?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think it's important to note that wisdom is also a sort of, I want to say, ahistorical. Maybe that's not the right term, but wisdom. Yes, we're applying wisdom to the times that we live in, and applying it to the polarization, social media, these things. But I think wisdom, to a certain extent, is the same as it would be today as it would be, 1,000 years ago. So you're also kind of writing, I think, much more broadly as well. So it's something that I've thought about in writing some of the things in this book, that it's also a certain timelessness to wisdom.
Let me ask you another kind of pushback question. There's a tension here, it seems, between solidity, right, and fluidity, right, without becoming ideological. And so as I read your book, I mean, I think some people could worry that you're maybe a little bit suggesting a relativist approach, right? And that there is sometimes a real problem of ideological rigidness. There's sometimes a problem of confirmation bias. I mean, it's a real big issue. I think we can all agree on that. There's also the problem that people think there's not truth. And so they have this kind of short term, we're just going to agree to disagree, which later actually develops an ideological rigidity of this is the only way to say things. A friend of mine who's a professor told a story where he said, he tells his students his freshman year in college, "Now I want to let you know something. Sometimes you're going to be wrong. And we're not just going to agree to disagree. You're actually going to be wrong. And you need to be open to the fact that you may be in error." So how do you deal with this kind of tension between, you have to keep everybody's perspective open, you have to be cognitive, you have to see things in different ways and wisdom, but that we can't be so fluid that in effect that we end up becoming ideological relativists. And so Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, has this very famous line, which you may know, he says that it's a dictatorship of relativism. And that's surprising at first thought, because we think, isn't relativism open? But as Ratzinger, points out, relativism can only be a dictatorship because it pushes out any concept of truth. And once you push truth out of a possibility, then you stop the possibility of philosophos, of love of wisdom, of philosophy, and of, in fact, gaining wisdom. So how do you deal with this tension, or how would you react to my question?
Yeah, well, I think, so many things I want to say here, but a few things would be, I think we had a responsibility to the psychological literature on wisdom. And as I said, that was one of the things I think we wanted to present. This is what the research has shown, not obviously our research, but the research out there. And so they do talk a lot about sort of contextual, if you want to call it relativist thinking, of seeing things from multiple perspectives. And so it was important to present that. The cognitive flexibility, epistemic humility, if you want to use a more philosophical way of looking at it, is important. The Socratic virtues. But I think we also talk about the transcendentals here, truth, beauty, and goodness. And those are, I think, anything but relative. And telos. So teleology and the transcendentals, I think, is where I think we show, to a certain extent, more of our Christian understanding of wisdom, of more of a Aristotelian Thomistic way of understanding it as well, that there is purpose and meaning in knowledge and understanding. So I think that's where we try to find the balance between those two things.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah. So in the literature has that one element we have to address, but it seems to me like not only just, I have confirmation bias to agree with you, what you said, your second part, but it seems it's not just a religious, but a solidly philosophical question that wisdom only is, in a sense, matters embodied, if you want, or embedded in the context of a meaning and full and purposeful universe. And so the sense that I think that how I described it in different, very different ways, but we have two, I think, things pressing upon us right now. We have ideology on one hand, a technocratic solution to the problems of evil, sin, suffering, and death. And on the other hand, we have nihilism, meaninglessness. And it seems like this is actually why I think your book is quite important for our time, is that wisdom is the path between those two. It's neither ideology nor nihilistic relativism. But there is that it says the a priori, the assumption, okay, that the world is meaningful, and we're not, you don't necessarily need to demonstrate that, but it's there and it's experienced that way and embodied that way. Yeah. Am I getting that? Do you want to critique me?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think wisdom involves kind of a fluidity in applying certain eternal principles, if you want to call them that, the forms or archetypes, or, it's sort of when to apply which in which context kind of thing. It's that orchestration of information, like the conductor of all these things. And I think that does require some fluidity. Relativism is maybe another word for it, but certainly not in a nihilistic, your wisdom is your wisdom, my wisdom is my wisdom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's good. Good answer. But Mark, do you want to jump in before we move on?
Yeah, I as with your other pushback question, I really find it wise. I think it's a great question. I heard once a metaphor that a window could be stuck open or closed, and if it is, it's not going to be a very helpful window. You want a window that can open and close. And there's been some nice reviews of the book, but one of the things we've had in a couple reviews is that here we are as authors, both Christian, Paul Catholic, me Protestant. And we don't really argue for our Christian faith in the book. We talk about transcendence, but I think it's a legitimate point that maybe we should have closed the window a little more, a few more times in the book, and talked about our own faith commitments and how those have been helpful for us and how we understand wisdom.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, that's interesting. I guess my question was not so much like what's your faith. I was actually more thinking of it philosophically, that in a sense, that in the face of ideology on one hand and nihilism on the other, we need wisdom, but that wisdom isn't simply a middle ground. It does take truth very seriously and takes a meaningful universe very seriously. I thought you kind of dealt with that. Just my push. Let's keep moving forward, because you have, in a sense, a fourfold path to wisdom. And again, if I ever misrepresent you, please correct me. I don't want to do that. But in my understanding of the book is that you have, we set out this kind of, here's the idea of what wisdom is. It's embodied. It requires critical contemplation, et cetera. And then there's this path to wisdom, and that we can actually practice these things to get more wise. And these four things are knowledge, detachment, tranquility, and transcendence. So you go through knowledge, and you say that there's really three kinds, or maybe more, I guess. There's three kinds of knowledge. Okay. I have notes here, and it was really easy to take notes because you have there's three kinds of knowledge, and there's 5 characteristics of the 3 kinds. I mean, that's this is great. Wow, I wish I could take things like this. Okay. But you say there's factual knowledge, right? So you need to know something, right? And so you give the example of this. I thought was a great example of one of your patients had a problem. I think it was depersonalization, and she began to see her life like a movie. And she came to you like, "Am I crazy?" And you said, "No, It happens to a lot of people. And that was, I really love that example, because I actually sometimes do that with my children. They'll ask me, and I remember, as I told you, my mother was I don't know if I told you this, my mother was a psychiatrist. And so I would ask her questions about these kinds of things, and philosophy of the person, the overlap. And I remember she would explain, sometimes she would talk to patients. And one of the things she had to assure them is that they weren't crazy. They were just having this or that problem. One of my older daughters said, a friend of hers said, I'm not comfortable in my body. Told my daughter this. And she said, what do I say to her? I said, well, you and 8 billion other people, like, nobody's totally comfortable in our body, right? And that's okay. And that's like kind of walking through that in a sense, like sometimes we think, oh my goodness, I'm the only person that's experiencing this. So I like the factual knowledge that you gave, just because it wasn't simply, 2 + 2 is 4, but also like teaching somebody and their growth for wisdom that, okay, we all have struggles. We all have difficulties. We can work it through. Let's keep forward. So I like that. You can comment on that. And the second one is procedural knowledge, which is like how to do things. And that's practical wisdom. And then you get to this idea of enriched knowledge, which is really the kind of core of your notion of wisdom, as I understand you're arguing it. Do you want just go ahead and comment on factual and procedural if I didn't do it justice? But could you develop this idea of enriched knowledge?
Yeah, I think, just a quick response to the section on knowledge is I think as a student for years, that was one of the reasons why I was interested in the topic of wisdom too. As a student, you take in information, you take in data, if you will, and knowledge, but that doesn't necessarily, mean that you develop wisdom. And so I was really interested in this question of the difference between knowledge, intelligence even, and wisdom. And what's the differences? And so this is kind of fleshing that out a bit, some of the nuances. And I think factual knowledge is really just that. It's information, it's data, it's what you can find on Wikipedia. You can find, factual knowledge. I think so, probably usually. And then procedural knowledge would be, understanding how to build things, how to use some of that factual knowledge to apply it to things. What would Aristotle call that? Techne, maybe, the technical knowledge of understanding how to do things. And enriched knowledge is that deeper knowledge that I think is connected more to wisdom, to meaning, to values, that not when knowledge hits a deeper understanding of a person and their worldview, that's where I think you get the cultivation of wisdom with some other ingredients in there.
So, and I might add that these notions are applied in real life, and we have to really keep that in mind. So if the check engine light comes on in your car, you have some basic knowledge, and then you have to know what to do. You have to need procedural knowledge, so you know how to deal with that. But that's not the same thing as someone who feels uncomfortable in her body. It's not the same thing. So the guy that developed these ideas originally, Paul Baltz, lived in Berlin during the fall of communism. He's encountering something at a different level. Paul and I are psychologists. We sit with people who are facing into the angst of living and the deepest tragedies of life. These are times where basic knowledge and procedural knowledge need to be enriched to deal with the major cataclysmic events and challenges that life offers us.
Yeah, I heard you talk on actually, I would listen to a podcast with you. And one of the things you talked about was how both of you gained wisdom just by sitting with and encountering people who are suffering and helping them go through that suffering. That too was a broadening of the perspective.
Yeah. And I think from each other as well. We have a lot of similar views on things, but we don't, we also differ on some things. And I've learned a lot from Mark over the years. And I think sometimes some of what's in this book is our own, I think, tension and dialectic of understanding some of these things.
Mm-hmm. And you deal with that tension in your first, so the characteristic of enriched knowledge is that you have to seek broader perspectives, and you set up this tension between, you have deeply held values and that are true and good, that we have to live according to, and considering other people's positions without falling into only an idiot would think that. That's the example you give. Like the wrong starting point is only an idiot would think the following, and that you have this tension between this broader perspectives. I guess we talked about it a little bit already. So in the sense, that's really the same tension between truth
Mm-hmm.
and openness to other ideas. And then you have this idea of, okay, so now you have to integrate these broader perspectives into yourself. And that's a hard challenge. Could you talk a little bit about that and how you avoid confirmation bias, or with still holding on your deep values? That how do you have are there practices that you suggest that help you keep your deeply held beliefs so that you're not just kind of floating in the wind and losing yourself, as it were, with avoiding rigid thinking?
Yeah, I think the example that we give there of Lincoln and the way he approached I think it was his cabinet, of having different viewpoints, different political people from different political parties. And it was a great example of that. Lincoln had his own values and beliefs on things, but I think he saw the importance of having opposing views, of differing views, and having them at least at the table and listening to them and understand that somehow made his understanding of things richer. Doesn't mean, right, he was still going to maybe have his own views on things, but he was going to listen, and he was going to hold views lightly. I don't know exactly what Lincoln was thinking, but I think that example, gets to that of, you have your values and beliefs, but you can still listen to others and hold the tension of their views. You do have to choose, but I think it has to do with that epistemic humility there.
Well, I also think of a story I'll try to keep brief, but it's one I learned after the book was published. But a Stanford professor by the name of Lee Ross, who developed something early in his career called the fundamental attribution error, which is commonly known, and I won't describe it here. If listeners want to Google it, you'll find thousands of descriptions of it. But Ross went on, when a Stanford professor does something, it gets attention. So there's lots and lots of attention to the fundamental attribution error. But he goes on then and he studies conflict in the Middle East and other places. And 2 years before his death, he essentially changes it. He says, that old thing, that's not really the fundamental attribution error. It's this. And he described these 3 steps. I know the truth. If you knew what I knew, you would agree with me. And if you still don't agree with me, then you're an idiot. Those are basically the 3 steps of naive realism, what he calls the truly fundamental attribution error. So to your question, I think we have to challenge ourselves in all 3 of those things. I know the truth. Well, I know some truth. I don't know all of the truth, but I know some truth. If you knew what I knew, you would agree with me. Well, not necessarily. People have different perspectives. That's what Paul was talking about. Even as authors, we had some different perspectives. And 3, if you still don't agree, you're an idiot. Well, let's just not call people names. So it seems to me that there are ways that we can sort of figure out wisdom in the midst of this tension between knowledge, but not feeling like we have all knowledge.
Yeah, I think, I agree. Like, don't call people names unless they really deserve it. No, that's a joke.
Okay.
I tricked you. Mark was all worried. He's like, oh my goodness. Like, he completely missed the point. Okay. No, no, but I think that the point, that's my joke, is that, unless they really deserve it, is in fact falling prey to this exact thing that you've set out. Right. And so it's interesting. Like, I have quite a few children of different ages, and it's interesting to see their argument stages. And at one point I had a discussion with one of my children when they were like maybe early teenager. He said, "You don't listen to my arguments." They said, and I said to me and my wife, I said, "Oh, we listen to your arguments." "No, you don't listen to my arguments." And so I had to walk through 2 meanings of the word argument. There's one meaning of the argument, meaning I have a discursive, syllogistic reasons for what I believe, and 2, my arguments are, this is what I hold. And just because I don't agree with what you hold doesn't mean I didn't listen to your argument. I just think you're wrong. And this goes back to this point I was making with this professor who had to say, like, sometimes you're just wrong. And I think that's what's really, I'm kind of repeating myself, but I think it's important because we either are right or relativists. Like, no, those are not the 2 options for us. And I like how you laid that out. I think another point that struck me as I was thinking about it is 2 things as you both were talking is, when you integrate broader perspectives, I think part of that connects to your idea of being humble, aware of your own limitations. But I also think that seeing the other person not as an object or a rival that is someone to crush you or you have to crush, but as seeing the other person as a subject who has subjective experience, understanding, and that when you enter into and this is where I think truth is so very important, actually. I mean, this is like C.S. Lewis, Abolition of Man deals with this. But when you take truth seriously, now you can really wrestle. You can really open yourself up to like finding out the truth, because you see the other person not as an object to be conquered, but as a subject like you, and that both of your souls can expand. That strikes me. And I think like this is, I think, the work of the John Paul II, the personalist norm. He sees where the proper response is love and to a person, and you have to respect that person as a subject. And the other is, I had a professor in graduate school who had this line that it's always stayed with me. It's one of the most important things I learned. And he said, reality comes from God's mind, and philosophical language comes from our mind. And no one single philosophical language or exposition is going to exhaust and articulate all of reality. And, you mentioned Thomas and Thomist earlier. I mean, St. Thomas himself didn't think his view articulated or exhausted all of reality. And if he and Aristotle didn't pull it off, I think that creates the case for us to be humble. And I like how you articulate that.
And he drew from multiple sources, by the way, right? So
a team of rivals for sure. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You talk about recognizing uncertainty and change. I think we've talked about this. Let me ask a question. So one of the things I've been thinking about a lot and talk about when I think about knowledge and rationality is that there's another type of reason. Like I'll give this, like, reason has to do with interiority and different kinds of knowledge. There's another kind of knowledge or reason. I think it's called inarticulate rationality. Or connatural knowledge. It's like a type of intuition. It's something that you in a sense intuit that you can't really articulate. So, you have this idea, like, if you don't know what it is, if you can't explain it, then you don't know what it is. Well, that's actually not true, because we don't know how to explain how we ride a bike, but we do. Do you deal with this question maybe in your work or in the book of how do you deal with intuition and the tension between that and confirmation bias, and kind of wrestle these things out? Do you ever deal with that kind of, maybe not in the book, but at least in your clinical work? What role do you think what the tradition would call connatural or inarticulate rationality plays in your understanding of knowledge and wisdom?
Yeah, this sounds like unknown, right? Unknown knowns in a way. Is that, the things that people maybe know, but can't really articulate. But
like Michael Polanyi calls it personal knowledge. Sometimes It's like, I think connatural knowing, it's something we, in a sense, we share knowledge of something because we share a nature. So I think maybe it's Paul Claudel or somebody has this idea, like, we even have knowledge of a rabbit because we're both creatures. And then the three of us, we have a certain connatural knowledge of one another because we're all three of us are the same. We share the same nature, even though we're unique and unrepeatable. I don't know. It's just something I think about a lot, and you've done a lot of work on wisdom and knowledge. So I just wanted to ask if you had any insights in that.
Well, I was just going to say, I know that Carl Jung, I'm not a Jungian, but I know that Carl Jung wrote about some of these concepts too, the sort of distinguishing between the rational and what I think he might have called the non-rational, but I kind of like con-rational a little better. Are you saying Michael, con-rational?
Connatural knowing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
with
I
nature.
kind of like that a little better, because it's not non-rational, but it sort of transcends the rules of rationality that we normally think of. And Jung talked about sort of primordial knowledge, things that we're born with that we just have known from generations or ancestors in the past or whatever. But it's not something I know much about, but I appreciate the question.
Oh. No, it's something to look into. No, it's good. Thanks. Anything else on that, Paul? We can move forward. I just wanted to ask if you might have had anything.
I think some of that might be implicit in the book, and also the way we approach the topic by drawing from other cultures and other times is a way of, I guess, implicitly acknowledging that there's truths in Buddhism and Islam and Judaism, and maybe drawing some of this kind of intuitive, human, universal understanding of things by simply drawing from those different sources without maybe explicitly stating these other cultures and times also had wisdom.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no, good. Thanks. Yeah, I didn't want to take us too far afield. Just was a quick question for you. So, a quick question on like the most complex topic ever. Just no big deal. Okay, so you go at the end of your knowledge section. You have in the following chapter. You actually say that there are problems that stop us from getting this right kind of knowledge, that are threats or challenges today, right? And one is just like an overwhelming amount of data. And you set out three challenges. You say we settle for non-wisdom, we have extreme polarization, and we lose the big picture. And you quote one of my favorites, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I actually have two podcasts about Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So I keep advertising the Moral Imagination here on the Moral Imagination podcast. So if you're listening to the Moral Imagination podcast, you should listen to the Moral Imagination podcast. There we go. So, but you quote Solzhenitsyn on page 61. He says, hastiness and superficiality, these are the psychic diseases of the 20th century. And more than anywhere else in the world, this is manifest in the press. In-depth analysis of a problem is anathema to the press. It's contrary to its nature. The press merely picks out sensational formulas. And of course, this is, exponentially worse now than it was when Solzhenitsyn wrote this in 78. And one of you writes, it occurred to me that my obsessive quest for every evening for the news was not helping me find wisdom. So can you talk about these settling for non-wisdom, polarity, extreme polarity, and losing the big view, and how these things are especially challenges to every age has its challenge to wisdom, but these are the three that you identify as the big ones for us right now. And what do we do? How do we think about it?
Yeah, this is Mark. This is that was a section that I wrote actually, and I also am a Solzhenitsyn fan. I noticed on your website, Michael, that you have the Gulag Archipelago on the site, and one of the really challenging, beautiful books in the world. Yeah, so I think Solzhenitsyn was a prophet in this regard. We, as you say, in 78 at that Harvard address, things were different than they are now. They're so much worse now. I have my students do this little exercise where I give them a quiz about Ivan Pavlov, and it takes them 30 seconds on their smartphones to answer all these questions that would, and I then sort of illustrate that if I were doing this, and when I was in graduate school, it would have taken me weeks to answer the same questions, because I would have had to go to the library, search for this, and on and on and on. So what do we do when we're so saturated? We can ask Bixby or Alexa or Siri for anything we want, and we have an instant answer for it. And what do we do in that kind of era where data is just everywhere? And I think what we try to do in the book is say, wait a minute, data is not the same as wisdom. In fact, it's only a very rudimentary substrate of wisdom that we have to go through all sorts of. Well, in the definition we were talking about, we talked about purgation. We have to go through all kinds of sifting and filtering of all this data. And we're not inclined to do that because the acceleration of data, we have so much more data today than we did a year ago or 2 years ago. The acceleration is just overwhelming. So we have to be very deliberate and intentional about trying to sift this out, finding good conversation partners, listening to thoughtful podcasts like this. These are the sorts of things we need to do more than scrolling through Instagram or Facebook to find the information that we have in the world.
Yeah, I like Cal Newport's work on deep work and also digital minimalism, where he kind of gives you some guidance on how to use technology better. And same with Jaron Lanier and several other people. Okay, what about the polarization? This seems to be a problem. I don't know if you want to add on to anything else into that, or you want to move on to tranquility, to detachment. Anything else you want to add on the knowledge front?
Just wanted to say this setup seems like a great way to fail when you write a book that appeals to everyone, because in a way it will appeal to no one, because it's saying, right? Because I mean, marketing and consumerism will say you can't really know the big things. Don't really worry about the big picture, but instead focus on this narrow thing, which will give you temporary, pleasure and numb you from those big questions. And so, that's something I've thought a lot about, sort of writing for a general audience as you could be. And, we're not going to capture any one silo, any one sides of that, the polarization.
Yeah. Well, the good news is there are still human beings in the world, and human beings have, as you talk about in chapter 3, a telos. They have a purpose. They have a meaning. They're going somewhere, and people are they're in search of wisdom. They're in search of figuring out how to lead better lives. And so the good news is, well, you might not fit the Twitter memes of the world. At least you do have human people who want to read your book. Let's go through then this next idea. So there's a lot here, of course, that we're leaving out. I mean, this is 90 minutes or so conversation on a very complex book that took you not only a long time to write, but years of study. But to do we can hopefully do a little bit of at least what we can here in a podcast. The second thing you get to is this idea of detachment. And detachment is very also an ancient practice that you see, of course, in Judaism, Christianity, you see it in Buddhism. You see it manifest, of course, in different ways, right? But this idea of detachment. So one, I'd like you to talk about detachment, but I'd also just like to know, one of the things I liked about how you talked about detachment is that you didn't just talk about detachment from material goods, but also detaching ourselves from like our confirmation bias and not from our deeply held beliefs that, right, of being is good, that human beings have dignity and should be respected, that, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart. But from this kind of, and even second layer, but the third layers of certain things that you hold on tightly to that have actually kind of preventing you from getting wisdom. I liked how you talked about detachment. I thought that was convicting and challenging. Do you want to explain this? You explain how detachment is kind of the bridge between knowledge and tranquility. So you have the knowledge, but you don't have tranquility. And if you don't have tranquility, you're not peaceful, and you can't get transcendence. You can't really have wisdom. So you need detachment. Can you articulate what it is and maybe a couple of practices of how you get there?
Yeah. I mean,
and did I do justice to you, by the way? Did I do justice to your, feel free again, say, well, Michael, you missed the point, because I have to be open to other perspectives after reading your book.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's inconceivable to have a model of wisdom that doesn't involve some sense of detachment from, as you were talking about, maybe materialism or our own kind of idols of the mind, right? Which I think we get fixated on, any kind of fixation. And, maybe this is some of my understanding from a clinical psychologist perspective, again, of kind of sitting with people, often very different types of people with different types of issues and suffering through different things, and sitting with that. And I think just the practice of being a therapist, a lot of that involves just sitting with that in the kind of even-handed attention, as I believe Freud, described it, and listening and not getting fixated or stuck on one particular thing, which I think then narrows your gaze, and you maybe miss more of what the person is saying, more of what they're emotionally trying to convey to you. So really sitting with that broad perspective.
Well, Paul and I are both clinical psychologists. And one of the things we do in psychology is we help people tell their stories. But when they come to us, they're only the character in the story. They're the ones sort of living out the experience. But in the process of therapy, what people learn is to stand back and to view the story, even the story they're living in. And that is ultimately a detachment skill, to be able to stand back and say, this is who I am. This is the complexity of my world. This is what I'm experiencing. So psychologists, I think, have a sort of natural inclination to think about detachment because it's just the nature of our day-to-day work. And I think it does help promote wisdom. One of the early studies in Germany showed that psychologists, for weird reasons that we don't really understand, scored really high on all the wisdom scales they developed. But I think maybe it's because we're doing this constantly in our day-to-day work.
Or because psychologists wrote the wisdom studies that would score themselves higher.
Yes.
No, I'm just...
There is that possibility. Absolutely.
So I have a couple of questions that follow from that. One is just a practical question. What do you suggest to people in your work, or even to your friends and family? I mean, both you could, to help cultivate detachment? Because it seems like, as you said, Paul, you can't really have wisdom without detachment. And in fact, detachment, all these things are connected and kind of dialectically enforcing one another. But detachment really helps you get that enriched knowledge. It helps you get tranquil. So it seems to be, and of course, like, in the Catholic tradition, this idea of detachment is absolutely essential for your spiritual life. What practical steps or suggestions do you tell people that say, here's a couple of things that you could do to help you develop detachment?
Well, I mean, other than read this book, The Time for Wisdom.
But you're like worse than I am.
Yeah,
I the books.
I don't want you to, that's my over empathic nature I don't want you to feel, that you were just, out there by yourself promoting. So
thank you. Where everybody's got to self-promote. Yeah, come on.
I think, Michael, I think your question's a great example of what I might do, which is to sort of step outside of it. And you just asked us a question that was essentially asking us to be detached. So you could do the same thing with anyone in any circumstance. You could say, if someone else were in the situation that you're in right now, and you could step outside for a moment and observe that person, what would you say? What would you think? What would you be noticing and observing about what's going on with that person? Just as you did in your question just now.
I don't know if I did that, but thanks for giving me the credit. I like that. That's a good question. Okay, so I have a couple more, but I noticed something. You talk about self-knowledge earlier in the book, which we kind of skipped over, as like after knowledge, you get self-knowledge. You need to know yourself. And one of the things I wanted that there's a lot we could talk about, but I was thinking about the detachment, and then by stepping out, you kind of see yourself, and now you get some knowledge of yourself from a little bit of a different perspective. There's this one part where you say, having self-knowledge is going to be uncomfortable in some ways, right? And that makes sense because, this is, again, if you look into, say, the tradition of the examination of conscience, right, which is a Jewish and Christian tradition where you examine your conscience and you ask for forgiveness. I don't know about you, but I don't like doing the examination of conscience, right? I was thinking about your book, like, this is how I'll do the examination. Okay, let's thank God for the day and examine our conscience. Okay, I confess to Almighty God, right? Like, there's about like 1 second in between the confession, like, because you don't really want to think about the sin that you've committed, the things you should not have said, or that what you failed to do, right? So it's a bit hard to do this. So you need a sense of your self-worth, that you're loved. This is, again, I'm speaking now here very much of a Catholic tradition, but this idea of divine filiation, that you are in fact a son or daughter of God and you have value. So, Psalm 51 says God loves truth in the heart. And so you need to have that truth in the heart, but you also have to know that you can be forgiven. And so that, I think, this question, so I have like 3 or 4 psychological questions that I want to get with that setup. One of them is, without a sense of forgiveness or the ability to be forgiven, when you're dealing with people who are struggling with their own hurt, the hurt they've done to others, and some real clinical problems, how do you address the situation of a person who maybe doesn't have a concept of their own worth and dignity or the capacity for forgiveness? And that capacity for forgiveness, or that understanding of forgiveness in our polarized social media materialist world, is dropping. So I think people are struggling with that. Feel free, again, to say at any point, this is what this podcast is for. You say, no, Michael, I think it's a bad framing of the situation. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that like there's really a decrease in the ability of understanding of forgiveness. There's like more tolerance and absolutely no forgiveness whatsoever. And then materialism makes it hard. And it seems to me psychology can almost be worse if you're like, here's your problem, put it in front of your face, but you can't be forgiven or learn to forgive others. How do you deal with that problem? And again, please don't feel framed in by my question if you think it's not a fair one or a good one. Reframe it if you so desire.
I would say I think it does speak to an over-attachment to some fear, right? I think when we try to cancel someone, or delete, erase them, we are trying to really delete or erase whatever fear, was being brought up in us, about this particular situation. So I think forgiveness is important. I think grieving losses, which is something we talk about in the book, comes to mind with this, that life is a series of losses, as the existentialists, help us see that, things are moving towards, entropy, and we are either forced to have things ripped out of our hands or we let them go. And I think that grieving loss is an important element of that. And that can be past, present, and future, griefs that we have about our life. And I think when we don't do that, we hold on too tightly and then want to find some enemy upon which to project our pain and suffering onto.
Yeah, that's great thought, Paul. I appreciate that. So the question really sort of speaks my language. My most enduring interest over my entire life has been the topic of grace. I'm actually working right now on my 4th book on the topic of grace. And your question draws me into that space. And I will just say that I think as Christians, sometimes we get this a little backward. We assume that the first thing we do is we confess our sin, and then the response is forgiveness from our sin. And while I believe that's true, I think the other direction is even more powerful. To illustrate this, I'll go to that sort of classic Les Miserables scene where Jean Valjean is sort of escaped with the silverware from the bishop's home, and he's arrested and he's brought back, and the bishop forgives him for taking the silverware, and he gives him the candlesticks too. And in the book, it doesn't show up in the movie, but in the book, 24 hours later, Jean Valjean is sitting on a rock observing children, and he's just overwhelmed with a sense of brokenness of his sin after that incredible portrayal of mercy and forgiveness. Yeah. So I think sometimes we just get this backwards, that we have to demonstrate forgiveness and grace and mercy before people can encounter their brokenness and their sin. I think that's what we do in therapy a lot, is we give people a space of grace so they can start to explore their brokenness rather than assuming they have to come in with their brokenness.
No, that's beautiful. I think, and I actually agree. I think it's really important. I think that, this in forgiveness, that there's an underlying a priori foundation that being is good, that you are loved. Yeah. And, it's in the Gospel of John, or the letter of John, like, he loved us first, right? God loved us first. We love him because we respond to his love first. And I think this idea then of, even when I talked about Psalm 51, right? Say God loves truth in the heart. I heard someone who was a Dominican sister actually explain on confession that in order for you to confess your sins, and I always tell this to the children, like, you have to know that God loves you. Like, and I think you say that beautifully, Mark, like, you really can't feel brokenness until you know you're loved. Until you know you're loved and that forgiveness, then in a sense, the brokenness is not full. It's not complete. Maybe that's too strong, but I do think it's a very important point that's what's, it's almost too scary, too fearful, too much. It takes too much of you to admit and to feel that brokenness, unless you know that you're actually deeply loved because of who you are, not because of what you did.
Right.
Do you want to correct that or push back? I mean, you're a clinical psychologist, so I'm just a lowly philosopher. What do I know?
I just want to say yes. That's the way I see it too.
I have another question. It requires willingness to explore and become intimate with the dark corners of our minds that are much easier to hide than bring into the light. And you talk about various things. So this is a question I have. It's maybe not directly related to what you're doing, but I have two clinical psychologists like sitting in front of me in windows. I'm going to take advantage of it. That one of the things that JP3, that's Jordan Peterson, not John Paul III. That's one of our jokes. One of my teenage son, he called him JP3. So I just think that's hilarious. So Jordan Peterson has this section where he often talks about, part of it's in this context of meekness, and he says you have to, but he often says you have to go into the depths and understand how like bad you can be in the dark part. And I think there's absolutely some truth to this, because you do have to realize you can have a false image of yourself. Like, oh, I'm just so gentle and kind. Like, you're not gentle and kind. You're rough. You're bad. You're violent, and you have to stop it. You have to go in to see the dark. I do worry in the way that Peterson says it, and that I think there's two elements to this. and maybe this is confirmation bias, or this is at least a deep influence of the Jewish and Catholic tradition, that you have to be careful going into the dark parts, that can actually lead you down into holes of despair and darkness. And I'll say from a spiritual element that I don't think Peterson takes demons seriously. I just don't think he understands the tradition. I don't think he's read, like, maybe he has. He's welcome to come on my show. I get a lot of listeners, and I actually like a lot of the work of Jordan Peterson. I think he's very interesting, and some of his stuff on Genesis I think is very interesting, and his PTSD stuff I think is also very interesting. So, but I think, like, it seems that he's like unaware maybe of like John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, and maybe he's not. Maybe he is. Whatever. I'm not trying to state anything unequivocally here or unequivocally. I'm just saying, I think it's a kind of a mistake. It's a little bit of an error to go too deep in the darkness of yourself, because it can lead you into places that you don't want to go. Do you think that's wrong? Right? Or how do you manage this tension between, you have to be able to realize that the line, as Solzhenitsyn says, between good and evil goes through the human heart, that you are capable of profound evil, and you better be aware of that so that you don't fall prey to it. But you start going too deep, and it can create, I think, psychological and spiritual disorder that you're just not ready for. What do you say?
I think yet again, you've answered the question here in many ways with that, our capacity, we have each of us a capacity for evil, as, Peterson talks about. I mean, this is also certainly drawn from Jung's notion of the shadow here, that, right. he would describe, I think, psychological spiritual growth as a confrontation with the shadow, and integrating the shadow side into the personality. And so, yes, I think it's again, like detachment, may be impossible to talk about wisdom without talking about that we could be the bad guys too. We could be wrong. Yep. I think it also speaks to what you were just talking about with people being unforgiving, online and canceling people, that there's a sort of lack of self-awareness there, that you could be wrong, or you could also do things that could merit your being, canceled or in some way. So I just think that self-knowledge, really has to involve this notion of the shadow, of our capacity for evil. And then, yes, not to sit in it and ruminate and dwell there, but at least to recognize it, acknowledge it, and I think reflect on who might be, good, bad, evil.
Yeah. Mark, do you want to?
I've always done short-term therapy in a model called cognitive behavioral therapy, but I have deep admiration for the folks like Paul who do what are called more depth therapies, which are longer-term therapies. And I think the heart of your question is really a depth therapy question, and that is the amount of time, how far you go in to the sort of depravity of our hearts depends on the amount of time you have, and it depends on the companion that's going there with you. If you have a trusted therapist that is going to go with you and help you find these dark spaces and help you come back out of them, and willing to spend as much time as it needs to do it, then I'd say, yeah, you can go pretty far in. But if short of that, and most people don't have that, it's probably not best to sort of go in and explore every nuance of the sort of depravity of the human heart.
Yeah, there's another example comes to mind. Mark and I are both in Oregon, and I won't get into the weeds of this, but there's a growing psychedelic.
That's not a pun. Is that a pun? You're not going to get into the weeds of Oregon. It's like road itself right there. Yeah. I'm not getting the weeds of Oregon, but there's psychedelic stuff going on around here now. Okay, sorry. I couldn't resist.
There's a growing, a growing movement of psychedelic, actually psychedelic therapy that's going to be happening here soon. And yep. And talking to friends and people in the field about it, I think there's so much optimism about it. And I think this is a great example where we sort of maybe falsely, naively assume that psychedelics and other new, drugs, medications are going to lead us into, outside of the ego, and we're going to find transcendence by moving outside of ourselves. But, there is a shadow side to that. And maybe that's not something that's talked about, that it could lead to ego inflation and thinking that we have this, superior knowledge and view and understanding of things. And so I think that's an example maybe of where, we can miss the shadow in our over optimism about something, which is good.
Yeah. And that's actually a really interesting way of thinking about it. I'm going to reiterate it, is that in a sense, this idea of going into yourself and deep with the psychedelics, you're missing that there's a dark side. You have to be careful. And I think that's actually maybe aligned also with not seeing the dark sides of ideology, because most people who become ideologues that end up killing millions of people, they don't start that way. They start with the positive and they don't see the darkness. And I'm just, I think, part of Solzhenitsyn here, I guess, maybe, and then we can move on. But I guess, so what I'm worried about is two things. One, both with use of psychedelics, and because I think a lot of it's an ersatz religion. I mean, what they're trying to do is get, some of the things they're trying to do is get religious transcendent experience. And I was talking to this one pastor who said, a lot of the graduate students, college students were doing this, but it's just ersatz. It's a similitude of the experience in the way that joy, right, can't be grasped. It's the fruit. Like the way this philosopher Dietrich von Hildebrand says, this is the superabundant fruit of a love relationship. So too, you couldn't use psychedelics to, in a sense, create a neurobiological, quote unquote, religious experience, but it's like grasping joy. It's just it's not an actual, it doesn't manifest in deep love of neighbor afterwards, right? It doesn't manifest in virtue. Right. If we think about it in intellectual or moral virtue, where you've grown in moral virtue, whereas an authentic religious experience where you're in relationship with the loving God and you see yourself as who you are is a foundation for actual growth in moral and intellectual virtue. Whereas the psychedelic is a drug that enables the neurobiological simulation of that. That seems to me to be a real problem. You feel free to critique me if you think I'm wrong. And second, because I'm a Catholic, I actually do take the question of powers and principalities seriously. And I do think by both going too deep into the thoughts of your dark self and also by using some of the psychedelics with not taking the shadow seriously, you are actually opening up a demonic realm. Maybe you're not comfortable in talking about that. But I do think, like St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila and the great mystics would warn us in that area.
I think it's an interesting question, Michael, and as a sort of a bit of the backstory, Paul and I did wrestle a little bit with this in an earlier draft of the manuscript, and our editor encouraged us just to take it out. And I think the problem was that, I think the problem is it's a little bit half-baked at this point. Whatever we said in that earlier draft, it's not like we hadn't really sort of figured it out. And it was people as mainstream as Michael Pollan writing about psychedelics. This is going to be a big conversation. This is going to be something that's going to take a lot of good thinking over a lot of years. And we just weren't prepared in this book to take it on and do a responsible job with it. So I think it's a great question. I don't feel like I have much by way of a response or an answer to that. And what we did try to come up with, the editor said, take that out.
Yeah,
maybe that's your next book on psychedelics. And then one more thing on the darkness shadow. Because I absolutely think that you have to know that you're capable of profound evil. If you don't, you're naive. Like, I guess maybe the way that I've heard Peterson say it multiple times. So if it was just once, I would have, but multiple times, that I just think maybe you've answered a bit, Mark, that you need to do it very carefully with a trusted guide. And I think second, you're not every thought you have. And this is like a real problem. And I actually, to promote my podcast, I have an interview with Noel Mering, who's a philosopher who wrote a book called Awake, Not Woke. And we talk about this weird thing that goes on where there's this performative morality. So every transgressive, weird, evil, perverted thought you have, that's the real you. And, any attempt to be virtuous, well, that's just performative. Like, no, you're not every thought you have. You're going to have a lot of crazy things. We do not understand the complexity of the mind, I really like this book by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and Its Emissary. This whole question of the unconscious and the subconscious. We don't understand all of it. We don't understand how our brain, our visual neurons work. Our eyes see something. We are seeing, quote unquote, many things that we're not cognitively aware of when we see it. And Joseph Ledoux at New York University has done studies with this, with like the amygdala and fear and danger. We, as St. Thomas says, things are coming through the senses. We're hearing and seeing, experiencing incredible amounts of things that we're not cognitively aware of. These things can manifest themselves in fear and subconscious, and things just pop out. We have a crazy thought here and there. And John of the Cross again writes about this stuff. I just think it's a little, I completely agree with you, Mark and Paul, and with JP3, with Peterson, that yes, you have, be aware, like Solzhenitsyn, be aware. You're not as good as you think. You have a dark side. You have a shadow. Be careful. But that the danger, unless that's done in a really solid, both anthropology, metaphysics, and psychology, it can be pretty dangerous for people who don't know what they're doing, and they can begin to identify themselves with their thoughts. And you're not every thought you have. How do you respond?
Well, I suppose that the detachment from thoughts would also involve detachment from those thoughts as well, to hold things lightly. And I think that's where there can be some psychological, maybe spiritual benefit as well, to holding to those thoughts as well lightly, that you're not overly attached with your darkness, with things like that. So
that's a good answer.
Yeah, and the
I was ready for you to
example of
fight
what
me
you
or something. Instead, you just gave a great answer. Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, the extreme example of what you're talking about is seen with obsessive compulsive disorder, when there are intrusive thoughts. So the idea is that it's so shocking to someone that I walk by the stack of knives in the kitchen and I have an impulse to pick it up and stab someone. It's so shocking that I might have that thought that it becomes then something I have to avoid for months or years, and it starts to take on an obsessive quality. And what you're saying is right, that these kind of crazy, dark thoughts, they just pop into our mind sometimes. It doesn't mean we're going to do it. It just, that's the way the human mind works. And so the treatment for OCD is often to sort of get people to be more accepting about the fact that we're conflicted, crazy, nutty people that have random thoughts that pop into our mind. And it doesn't have to, it doesn't mean that we're going to do these things. It just means that we're complicated.
Right. Everybody's uncomfortable in their body.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Everyone.
Yeah, that's
8 billion of it.
8 billion. Okay. So one more question on kind of clinical psychology here. And I'm taking us away from the book, but I think it's related to what you're doing with wisdom. I was talking to a friend recently, and he's a very serious person, theologian. And we were just talking about, it seems, and maybe it's wrong. So maybe the seeming is incorrect. So correct me if you think it is. But it seems to me, and Deems the data shows this, there's just a lot more anxiety. People are a lot more nervous. People are stressed out. Even like, healthy young teenagers, students, you see like they're all stressed. Like, why are you stressed? Like, oh, there's so much going on. School's going. And I just don't remember that level of stress. Maybe it was just me, but I've talked to other people. There seems to be more emotional suffering, more sadness, depression. You even see rise in suicide. Social media, I think, is part of this for sure. I don't think there's any doubt that social media, and I write about some of these problems in this little book I wrote called Digital Contagion, another self-promotion. You can buy that with wisdom, a time for wisdom, and you get a 2 for 2. You buy 2 books for the price of 2 books. Okay. But it is a serious question. You are both clinical psychologists. Are we seeing a rise in anxiety? If so, what is it? What's it from? And how do you think we should be thinking about it or addressing it? And then you can also connect how I'm assuming your book, Wisdom, it has something to say into this. And that's partially why you wrote it.
Yeah, I think living in a data. Oh, go ahead. I just think, this fits well with a lot of what we've already talked about. I think living in as we mentioned, a data-driven, society with the overconsumption of information, without a firm understanding of the human person, an understanding of human nature, which we also talk about, a foundational human nature. All that data and information, you don't know what to necessarily do with it, and I think it just kind of weighs a person down. And I can't speak to the level of anxiety in a 13th century Italian village, but my guess is that it would be more primal, right? It would be more about, food and shelter and the basics. But now we know about things that happen on the other side of the globe instantaneously. And all that, I think, without a firm understanding of the human person, human nature, and telos, I think the loss of teleology is a major factor here, really constricts our view by adding to the weight of our lives in the present moment.
Maybe you could just unpack that a little bit. So most listeners probably know what teleology has to do with ends, purposes. So it's the
it comes from
but also human nature too. Like obviously that's a massive question. I spent a lot of time. That's what in many ways it's the theme of this podcast.
Yeah, and get me in trouble answering that question, Michael.
But why don't you at least give a couple of points? So maybe just quickly on teleology, and then twice you said it's very hard for us to get all this data and information on its own. But when you combine that with misunderstandings or confusion about what it means to be a human person, what would you say are maybe the top 3 or 4 biggest errors or confusions that people are making that's adding to all this anxiety?
Well, I think I'm thinking of this quote from, I believe it's Rilke, who said that the art of wisdom is knowing what to ignore. And I think that we struggle with that I think more is better. So there's the, more overconsumptive nature of things. A lot of that's, I think, the capitalist consumerism, market driven, way of society, but more isn't necessarily better. And I think answering your question about telos, I think that's, Aristotle's understanding that the human person has an end or person. If you think of it in the sense of like an arrow that's being shot in the direction of a target, that it has that goal, purpose, end in mind, that the classical, pre-modern view in the West had. And so that kind of, gave yourself direction. It allowed you to orchestrate things that happen in your life towards that end or purpose. And certain things would be less important, and other things would be more important, especially ethics and I think morality.
Yeah. So like what's important, so without having that telos, then it makes it hard because now we just have so much data that we don't know what to ignore. Okay. That's helpful. Okay. So we've spent a lot of time. I really am grateful for your time, but I think we should. I want to just at least get through tranquility and transcendence. So we have this understanding of knowledge and detachment, and then I spent a lot of time asking you about clinical psychologists, some ideas and questions. Can you talk a little bit about how then detachment can lead to tranquility, what it is, and then move us into transcendence?
Yeah. So. Well, as we've just been talking about some of those strategies of what happens when detachment, pain, and suffering would be incorporated in that detachment category. What do you do with that? What are the strategies in your life that you have to not lead to bitterness and rigidity, but towards tranquility, towards a more equilibrium? And so I think tranquility really starts to speak to the emotional side of this. Again, we are clinical psychologists, and so looking at how we can cultivate, healthy emotions, and not necessarily positive emotions. I think there's often this misunderstanding that we want to move from negative and swing over to the positive. And I think it's more about kind of finding a neutral space and sitting with different types of feelings and emotions, a whole range of them.
Mm-hmm. One of the things we do in the tranquility section in the book is we talk about narcissism. And I found that when I've given talks on this book, that gets misunderstood easily. So it's not like we're going around saying people have narcissistic personality disorder, but we, in psychology, we tend to use that word fairly liberally. We just kind of throw it around, and in writing the book, we may have thrown it around a little too liberally. But by that, what we mean is it's so easy to build the world around ourselves, to sort of put ourselves at the center of every story. And when we do that, we miss an opportunity for tranquility, because especially for people of faith, the story is not about us. Yes, we're part of it, but the story is about God's providence, about the way it's a big metaphysical story. That's not just a story about Mark or Paul or Michael. And so that also then can lead to a sense of transcendence if we're recognizing that it's not all about me. It's not like Truman Show.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the question you just raised about, when I was talking about teleology. I think it's what unites us with other people as well. Having that fundamental human nature is the common ground that we talk about that can lead to the common good. That we share certain things with each other on a natural level.
Yeah, you talk about this sharing naturally. Sometimes a philosopher would call that intersubjectivity, but you actually say that in your chapter. Let's see, what number is it? 9. You say related to tranquility. I think there's 3 treasures, and one of them is compassion. And then you talk about this idea that you say that's an example of what researchers call self-transcendent positive emotions, STPE. Which is Barbara Fredrickson's work, and on positive psychology. And these include awe, joy, gratitude, peacefulness. And that these broaden our attention and help us to they broaden our attention, they give us resilience, and they move us beyond self-interest. Maybe if you could talk about them, and I don't know if you know this, but C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man talks about the idea of reasonable emotions. And he says that empiricism and relativism have taken away our capacity for reasonable emotions. John Paul II calls them spiritual emotions. And these are the things: love, truth, compassion, friendship, the things that you articulate, awe, gratitude. And I did there's a long question. We had a conversation once with the importance of gratitude as a foundational being, foundational attitude. And also Dietrich von Hildebrand, the philosopher, talks about these as well, but he uses big, complex German words for it. How maybe this is a question for Paul, but could you develop these, what are they, STPEs? And how does that relate to some of the tradition of reasonable emotions, spiritual emotions, and how do we then cultivate them?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a psychological maybe approach to those, reasonable emotions. Because I can't remember, I just recently heard this phrase, emotional incontinence, and it sort of stuck with me. And I think we find that so much these days, where the inability to, I won't say control, but manage and regulate a person's emotions in difficult situations and heated discussions. And so I think that's a way in which psychology has some literature, some scientific, empirical literature on understanding, reasonable emotions and ways to cultivate those.
Anything you would suggest? Like what would you say? Like, you're talking to somebody, I really need to cultivate these STPEs, these reasonable emotions. Like, what do you say? What do you do?
Learn to sit with and learn to experience them first. It's hard to regulate something that you haven't felt the energy flow of. So to learn to sit with uncomfortable emotions first, rather than to bar yourself from ever having to experience them, because they inevitably will happen at certain times. And I think the more you experience something, the more you can create a healthy habit of being with it, and less of a fear of it, less of a need to try to control it and kill it.
So Barbara Fredrickson, you mentioned, she's a psychologist at UNC, and she's got something called the PEP Lab, which stands for Positive Emotions and Psychophysiology. And she studies this stuff and has for a long time. But it's really fascinating, because when she started studying emotions, these positive emotions didn't act the way emotions are supposed to act. What, in psychology at least, what we see with most of the emotions that we study is that there's an action potential that comes with them. So you can take an emotion like fear, and you know how an individual is going to behave, and that will be to move away, to withdraw. Or disgust, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to get away if we're disgusted. So you could take an emotion, and it almost always predicts how a person will behave. But it didn't work in the PEP Lab, because with positive emotions, we don't do that. We don't feel gratitude and have a predictable human response to it. We don't feel awe and have a predictable human response. And that's where this notion of self-transcendent positive emotions show up, because these things get us beyond ourselves. They're not just about protecting ourselves or getting away when we're fearful or disgusted. They're bigger than that. And that's really taken on a really important part of positive psychology to see the people that are studying these STPEs and just the impact of the field.
Okay. Yeah, good. And then you also say like just simplicity and humility are the other steps. You go through in a chapter called Here Be Dragons. You talk about some of the threats to tranquility. And you've mentioned a little bit of them already, Paul, just like the idea for more, you just want more and more, keeping up with the Joneses, kind of, if I can have more. Carlo Lancialotti, who's the translator of Augusto Del Noce, kind of summarizes that we had a shift from Christian bourgeois to a pure bourgeois, where capitalism became detached, the market economy became detached from its sources and its Christian roots and morality, because he said that after the 68 revolution, everybody was expecting the revolution to usher in a new time, this kind of Gnostic new experience. And when it didn't happen, the hippies became yuppies. And what they did is we thought we're going to find material happiness. And so the sexual revolution, which Del Noce argues is an extension of the Marxist revolution, it became, in a sense, a commodification. Everything you could buy happiness, everything could be transacted. And this desire for more, and of course, then advertising. And so you have this, which we talk about like a Marxified capitalism, which sounds weird, but meaning that the principles of capitalism is no longer just like embedded in an understanding of freedom and human flourishing, but simply productivity and liberation, including sexual liberation, and that you're going to buy your happiness. So there's this whole like matter advertising more and more and more. You talk about that, and you talk about individualism. I'd like to ask you a question on individualism in a moment, but is there anything you want to say specifically about this more and this advertising that really is upsetting our tranquility, and any suggestions of how to address it from this wisdom paradigm?
I think one of the things, and again, I mentioned before, my wife's a sociologist and she's written about this, but one of the things we need to realize is that the job of marketing is to make us feel dissatisfied, that our life will be better if we buy a thing. And so the state of dissatisfaction, of sort of discontent is the very goal of the marketing agenda. So I think just being aware of that is helpful. Just say, okay, if I'm feeling these things, like I need to go buy the newest version of a phone because I'm just not happy, then that's the way I'm supposed to feel. That's the way people want me to feel. And I think if we can stand back and detach ourselves from that, it leads to an alternative where we can say, I don't think I'm going to choose to feel that way, even though they want me to. I'm going to just be happy with my current phone, and that's good enough.
Yeah, actually recently watched Bishop Barron's podcast. Sorry to promote another podcast on here.
No, but please. This is not a zero-sum game.
Bishop Barron's podcast. He had Shia LaBeouf. He's a well-known actor.
Oh, yeah.
And he was essentially canceled, I don't know, a year or two ago. And he was talking to Bishop Barron about he got a role, somewhat surprisingly, playing Padre Pio. So he'll be playing Padre Pio in a movie. And he talked about being a real low place in his life, and it sounded like, actually suicidal. And he said that he took on the role of Padre Pio, and for it, he had to hang out with these Franciscan friars. And he talks about the way that they treated him. They really, they didn't want anything from him. They didn't want to take a picture. They didn't want to, Instagram or tweet with him. They just, laughed with him. And it seemed like, he didn't use these words, but it seemed like they just, kind of enjoyed his being, shared their being with his being, kind of ontologically, and just the effect that had on him at such a difficult time in his life, and that taught him.
And he got baptized, didn't he? He converted to Catholicism.
Yeah. And that had,
welcome.
Yeah. And so I think that was a turn from his, Hollywood, actor lifestyle into this other mode of being, which I think the friars, showed him, embodied with him.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this, by the way, it's pretty much a standard problem. I mean, you read about the church fathers or Saint Benedict, we've got to get away from this consumerist world we live in, and I think it's always a struggle. The next thing you talk about and is individualism. And we don't have that much time, but I'm going to throw another little wrench here. You talk about individualism quite a few times in the book, and you give the example of, just kind of two examples, they're hypothetical, of two 15-year-old girls, one in Seoul, one in Sacramento. And you make this kind of, give this basically the kind of standard individualism versus kind of a collective view. I mean, I know that Korea is actually struggling with suicide. I think a lot of other depression. So let's not get into that. That's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is I've always been a bit skeptical of the individualist collective dichotomy. I don't think it's completely wrong. I just don't think it's sufficient. And I'll tell you why, and feel free to push back or disagree. So I am a critique of individualism. And I think it's, Alexis de Tocqueville actually warned us that individualism leads to centralization, and centralization exacerbates individualism. And I think we're in a place of hyper-individualism. This gets exacerbated by liberal anthropology of people like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau as well, and Marxian anthropology of individualism, and the pure bourgeois things we talked about, advertising. I mean, I think the individualism is a really serious problem. And we see loneliness and breakdown of family and a lot of other things. But I think, and collectivism can also be a problem as well, right? But I think that two things, and again, this is my view, so I'm asking you, you're more than welcome to disagree, debate. I welcome that. But one, I think that a Christian understanding gives a much richer view of the social nature of the person who's a unique, unrepeatable subject who's also in relationship, and that we're individuals in relationship, that we're embodied and we're embedded, and that's been lost. But I think that the idea that somehow a collective is better than the individual is, I think, also a mistake. I think that actually what's the healthiest is this social nature of the person with an associationalism. Because, I lived in Japan for 5 years, and people always say, oh, well, in the West, you're individualist, and here we're collective. Well, not really. I mean, a lot of America is very associationalist. If you read Tocqueville's Democracy in America, he says this is a characteristic of American society. And in fact, one of the things that sociologists, as you would know from your wife's work, Mark, is that we have a breakdown in community, right? The great book by Robert Nisbet in 1953, The Quest for Community. Of course, later, Robert Bella and Robert Putnam, and this whole breakdown of the family, Mary Eberstadt's work on family breakdown. I mean, it seems to me that that's just the wrong dichotomy. What we really need are embodied, embedded persons in community, in the principle of subsidiarity, in associations, not collective, where you become a cog in the machine of the capitalist or the communist or even the ancient society. And I'd say that with lots of nuance, the last part, not so much nuance on the first two, or this individualism where you ultimately are very easily just put into a mass of people. How do you respond to my critique, and how should we be thinking about the ways to avoid the dangers of individualism, which I think leads to unhappiness and lack of tranquility?
One of the things that comes to my mind is a saying I heard years ago that all taxonomies are wrong. And it seems to me that that's true in this case. It's a taxonomy that's fundamentally flawed. It's one that we've used a lot in psychology to help understand how cultures vary. And I think I would still want to push back a little on that whatever we call this thing, different cultures have different points of balance in terms of how they understand the relational part and the individual part of what it means to be human. And so it's probably not the only, or maybe not even the best taxonomy, but I think it at least highlights the fact that people do this differently in different parts of the world.
Yeah, and I think going back to that sense of interconnectedness through the common ground that we all share. The book, we talk about holding the end in mind, keeping the end of each of us individually, perhaps existentially, finding our own meaning and purpose, but also that we share an end with each other, whether that's individualist or collectivist. And I do think we've seen a real breakdown in any notion of a collectivist, union in America anyway. And I think a lot of that has to do with the loss of that understanding of the common good. As Thomas, St. Thomas talked a lot about the common good. And I think without a clear, understanding of human nature, the common ground is ever shifting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, no, that's helpful. Yeah. I think, Mark, I agree that I guess it's a start to think about how different cultures do it. I've always found that it ends up becoming kind of popified, and so that it becomes an obstacle to understanding. But I do think your point about at least it's a starting point makes this helpful. And I think really this is obviously a theme. I talk about this a lot, so listeners will hear me say this. But I mean, Tocqueville's worry about individualism and centralization. Individualism doesn't just cause centralization. Centralization exacerbates and encourages individualism. And so I think the revival of community and in the tradition we call the principle of subsidiarity, where people are working together, actually that inspires solidarity. But when everything is centralized and people kind of move in their atomized world, solidarity falls apart. So I think it's important. And that lack of community is really not only, I think, a cause of unhappiness, but it prevents the passing down of wisdom. Because if I take your early model, which we didn't talk about, that we see wisdom in exemplars, and it's in community that we learn wisdom. So I think these things are all connected. Well, I've taken so much of your time. There's a lot more in the book. We didn't talk about transcendence and everything, but do you want to just maybe give a quick summary of transcendence and any other kind of big picture things that you want to get across for the book and that you would like listeners to know about? I'm really grateful for your time and that I had this time not only to read the book, but to talk to both of you about it. I've learned a lot, and it's been helpful, convicting at times, but very inspirational. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. No, wonderful conversation. I'll just say that transcendence is likely the part that Mark and I's model maybe differs, and I think expands upon some of the psychological models. To be fair, they do talk somewhat about spirituality, but I think we take a much bigger, more significant view of transcendence. And it does follow from tranquility, that in the moments of equilibrium and peace, kind of the idea of the pool, the pool that's calm, the waters that are still can reflect more clearly the transcendent. And so I think that breaking through of something spiritual, something bigger than ourselves, maybe even bigger than our own human nature, kind of breaking through. And that's where I think the elevated insight comes in. And, wisdom involves insight, but it's an insight to the nth degree. And I think that speaks to the transcendent piece there.
There's in the psychology of religion, we study, we measure things, as we talked about earlier in the podcast. And there's this one item that shows up a lot of times on our questionnaires, and it goes like this: how important is your religion to you? And it's measured on a 5-point scale from 1, not at all important, I have no religion, to 5, extremely important, it's the center of my life. And I've always been a 5 on that scale. From my earliest memories, I've been a 5. It's been the essence of my professional work, is to think about how faith interacts with psychology. I think transcendence and wisdom is, and Paul, I suspect you're pretty similar on that scale too. And I think transcendence is that capacity or that desire to see that it's the center of our life, that there's someone out there that's bigger than us. And so I'll say that. The other thing I'll say is just an incredible joy to write a book with a former doctoral student who's gone on to do such impressive work in the field. And there's something transcendent almost about that, about having that sort of mentoring come full circle and realize that God's hands are on the things that we do. And it's been just an incredible joy for me.
That's really great that you got to do this. Just on the transcendent, you do say that this obsession with ratings and, again, individualism, which we talked about, these are obstacles to transcendence. How do you've talked, you have to read the book, listeners, to get the whole point, but how do you cultivate transcendence is in some ways it's kind of like the joy element that it can't be grasped, right? It's the fruit of a love relationship. It's the fruit of tranquility and detachment and knowledge, maybe, I don't know. But there are obstacles so that you can at least remove some of the obstacles. And you say that, there's obsession with ratings, individualism, but that somehow psychotherapy can be a pause button to kind of stop us from the blocks. We're toward the end here just because I've taken so much of your time, but I think this is an important part of your conclusion. So I'd like you to at least be able to articulate it. Can you explain that just a little bit?
Yeah, I think that we encounter that a lot in the field. What's the point of coming into this, this office and talking about all these painful things? It's like, it's hard work. And I think sometimes the response is just because it's important to sit with your feelings away from all the distraction and that's outside of this office. And so I think just it's important to take a pause and sit and think and feel. And I don't know if that necessarily leads to the transcendent, but in choosing the term transcendent, I think we were really intentional about trying to find a broad term that encapsulated a lot of what I think people look for in spirituality and religion. Sort of the spiritual, not religious group, I think, and oftentimes mean that they're looking for the transcendent in their life. And I personally have found that in religion, but, I didn't want to just limit it to the religious perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And anytime you put a model together and you have 4 discrete steps, they're not really discrete. There's so much overlap. So the example Paul just gave about sitting in therapy, really it's a detachment example. That what you do is you go in for 50 minutes a week and you can step outside of yourself. And instead of living inside your problems for those 50 minutes, you're standing outside and you're watching them through another person's eyes. And we're getting a bigger picture of ourselves when we do that. And in a sense, it is transcendence, right? It's self-transcendence. It's getting out of our own skin, looking from the outside, and it opens the possibility that someone else might be looking too.
Mm-hmm. And that's good. And I think it's like you kind of ended. This is, the human life in many ways, the philosophical life, the religious life is a search for wisdom, right? And so, this, you talk about, this is the time for wisdom. We have to, he said, you say at the end, this is your last, if we have good fortune, we'll begin to see something bigger than ourselves, some benevolent presence of love in the cosmos that holds us together and calls us forward in wisdom. And that wisdom, of course, is the Greek philosophos, right? Sophos is wisdom. And so philosoph is the philosophical truth, the love of wisdom. And the transcendent element, I think, is also related, even like the way many of the philosophers and some of the church fathers say, that the search for wisdom, the love of wisdom, ultimately leads you to wisdom himself, who's God. And there's that connection there, which I think you talk about with the Eastern, Gregor of Nyssa and Thomas Aquinas, and this kind of connection there. But also, just as you said, even if one is not a believer, this respect for, in a sense, seeing the world in this long, embodied, embedded, historical way can give us perspective to step out of our own moment and live better lives that give us a benefit. And I think that's this, in a sense, the natural human desire for wisdom. And so I like how you kind of connect the transcendence in that way. Any final thought that you encourage, any other books besides this one that you encourage people to read, or that you really think have been in your own life, besides in your own life, this is the product of all your work. But if you said, like, what are the 1 or 2 things that most impacted you, and in the almost the appreciation and growth in wisdom that you would recommend or suggest to others?
Well, I recently reread Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue. And I think had I reread that around the time that we were writing the book, it would have been, the presence of that book might have been felt more in there. But I found that book so helpful at this time. It's not an easy read, but I think it's a book that's important enough to really take the time to chew through, if a person can, because I found that book just so helpful. And some of my friends have been asking me, what's the trick to getting like a book published, and it was their first shot at getting a book published. And all I can say is write your first book with Mark McMinn, if you want to write a good.
Mark, you need a lot of phone calls. A lot of phone calls coming.
Yeah, it'll make you look a lot better. Make your writing look a lot better. I would sometimes.
We all need Mark's help. Mark, I'm going to call you soon. Trust me.
Get versions back of things I'd sent, and I'd look at it and say, yeah, that's pretty much how I'd say that.
That's too kind. I will say that this is a strange coincidence because Paul's book that he mentioned was the same one I would have mentioned. I wrote a book in 2017 called The Science of Virtue. And the first thing I did was go back and reread McIntyre's book, After Virtue. And it is hard read, but it's so important. It's such a good word. And it makes us realize how hard it is to even grasp the notion of virtue in our particular cultural moment. So, it's a great book.
Good. Thanks. I'll put links up to that and a lot of the other things we discussed. Paul, Mark, thank you very much for all your time. A long discussion on your book, A Time for Wisdom. Paul McLaughlin, Mark McMinn, Templeton Press. Thank you very much for joining the Moral Imagination podcast.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for having us.